Please join us on our spring 2017 visit to the maritime provinces of northeastern Canada. We left home on May 14th and spent the first night at the Virgin River Gorge near St. George, Utah. On night 2, we did some dispersed camping in the Rockies, not too far from Leadville, Colorado. When we awoke the next morning, it was 32 degrees inside the camper. Downtown Leadville. Here we are approaching the Eisenhower Tunnel west of Denver. It's situated at over 11,000 feet in elevation and is more than 1.5 miles long. In western Kansas, we encountered many thunderstorms, and the local radio stations broadcast tornado warnings on a regular basis. It was still quite stormy when we pulled into Wilson State Park in central Kansas that evening. However, after a very blustery night, the morning dawned sunny and windless. The tornado warnings of the previous day were a bit disconcerting for us. My navigator had to continually try to locate the counties in danger on the map and then figure out where we were in relation to that danger. We saw this sign when we were gassing up that day. Since we were in Kansas, we decided to make a slight detour and visit the Oz Museum in Wamego. Visitors are greeted in the lobby by the Tin Man. It was an interesting and informative place. Aside from displays such as these, there were many artifacts and behind-the-scenes stories regarding the book and the movie. We arrived in New Jersey on May the 20th and stayed for 10 days, primarily visiting with my dad, who lives in an assisted living facility there. Longtime friend Dick Gerber drove down from North Jersey to spend some time with us. And this is Gus, the lovable mascot and therapy dog who roams the halls of the assisted living facility. On Memorial Day weekend, an organization called JARS offers helicopter rides near the place where my dad lives. And Dick, Ginny, and I went up for a brief ride. Neither Dick nor Ginny had ever been in a helicopter, and they both had a blast. During our stay, we also visited with my cousin Eileen, her husband John, and their family at their Jersey Shore home. On May the 30th, we said goodbye to Dad and drove up to my brother and sister-in-law's place in Central Valley, New York. Tom and Laurel had rented a 25-foot motorhome and joined us for the next 8 or 9 days. The 4 of us spent the next 3 days at different campgrounds in Maine. The first night was at Bradbury Mountains State Park. That campground was adjacent to Freeport, Maine, home of L.L. Bean, so the following morning we spent a few hours looking around town. Here we are posed in front of a giant boot at the main L.L. Bean store. Ginny couldn't resist taking this photo outside of one of the shops in town. Acadia National Park in Bar Harbor, a beautiful place. And this is our camp at Cobscook Bay State Park in Maine. As this slideshow progresses, several themes will become apparent. One theme is that most of our camps on this trip were located right on the water. Ginny relaxing at Cobscook Bay. We crossed into New Brunswick, Canada, and drove up the coast to the Bay of Fundy. Canada is celebrating their 150th anniversary in 2017, and they have placed red Adirondack chairs at many locations around the country. We encountered quite a few of them as the trip unfolded. The Bay of Fundy is said to have the greatest tide fluctuation of any place in the world. In some areas, the difference between high tide and low tide is greater than 40 feet. We stopped in the town of Alma to look at the local fishing and lobstering fleet at low tide. While the rest of us were looking at the boats, Ginny wandered off and struck up an acquaintance with a guy named Sparrow. A little farther up the coast, we stopped at the Cape and Rage lighthouse to look around. That evening, we settled in at Murray Beach Provincial Park. It was a beautiful setting, but was colder and windier than we expected. This was a sign of things to come. The next day, we crossed the Confederation Bridge from New Brunswick to Prince Edward Island. The bridge is 8 miles long, and constructing it was quite a feat of engineering. We set up camp at Linkletter Provincial Park near the town of Summerside and went off to do some exploring. This elaborate cathedral is Our Lady of Mount Carmel and is located in a sparsely populated area along the coast. Our camp at Linkletter Provincial Park. It was at Linkletter that we first ran into Chuck and Barb. They're a couple from Minnesota who were camped next to Tom and Laurel and with whom we really hit it off. More of them later. The beach in front of our camp. Jenny took extended walks on the beach and almost always brought back some small treasures of nature. This photo was taken in the village of Victoria. Later that day, we stopped to look around in the fishing village of Rustico on the north shore of Prince Edward Island. A nice lunch on the water. On Wednesday, it was time for Tom and Laurel to head home. This parting shot was taken about 10 a.m. and notice our clothing. It was still quite cool. One very good thing about the cool windy weather, though, is that it kept the black flies and mosquitoes away. Later that day, Jenny and I went to see the sand dunes at Prince Edward Island National Park in Greenwich on the north coast. A spectacular beach, yet we only saw 3 or 4 other people in the time that we were there. Potatoes are the main agricultural crop on PEI. Everywhere you go, there are red dirt fields that are being prepped for potato planting. We spent that night at Brudenell Provincial Park, then hopped the ferry to Nova Scotia in the morning. This lighthouse was located next to the ferry landing. They grow 'em big in the Maritimes. We spent the next 2 nights at Myra River Provincial Park south of Sydney. This far eastern end of Nova Scotia is called Cape Breton. Aside from being absolutely gorgeous, Cape Breton is also known for its coal mines. On a very rainy Friday afternoon, we visited the Glace Bay Miners Museum. Some of the mines in the area extend 7 miles off the coast beneath the Atlantic Ocean. However, the one we toured was no longer operating. Ready to go underground. The carts that these miners are packed into are called rakes. The ride often took an hour or more in and an hour or more out, and the men were not paid for that travel time. Note the low ceiling. The tallest part of the shaft was 5 foot 2 inches and the shortest area was 4 foot 2 inches. Miners had to work stooped over all day, every day. Prior to mechanization, the coal carts were pulled by ponies. These ponies spent their entire lives in the mine. Here we see a 4-foot 2-inch section of the tunnel. Our guide, Wishy Donovan, worked in the mines his entire life, beginning at the age of 9. Ah, a new recruit. One of the miners figured out how to grow certain species of flowers using little to no artificial light. The following day, it was a 6-hour ferry ride to Newfoundland. Into the belly of the beast. Here are several views from the deck as we pulled out of the harbor at North Sydney. While reading a book in this colorful lounge area, I spotted Chuck, the friend we had made 5 days earlier on Prince Edward Island. He went and got Barb, and we finished the ferry ride swapping stories. We also decided to stay at the same provincial park that evening. This is the waterfall at Cheeseman Park where we spent the night. We said our goodbyes to Chuck and Barb in the morning and traveled north, then east to central Newfoundland. At Notre Dame Provincial Park that evening, Jenny spotted this beaver going about his business. These guys are always fun to watch. We struck out to the north toward Twillingate, and on a spur-of-the-moment decision, decided to catch a ferry to Fogo Island, a place we knew nothing about. This was our first encounter with the ice that would, in many ways, come to define the rest of our time in Newfoundland and Labrador. The area was experiencing the coldest spring in 43 years, hence all the ice and icebergs in the latter part of June. The ferry captain decided not to make the scheduled stop at the Chance Islands as the ice was too thick to dock. The ferry ride made you feel as if you were on an icebreaker. It was amazing. A major downside of all the ice was the inability for local fishermen, lobstermen, and crabbers to get out and make a living. We talked to several locals who said that the risk of losing their gear to the ice was too great and they would simply have to wait until the ice diminished. The number of picturesque fishing villages that we saw on this trip was beyond counting. The large building in the background is the Fogo Island Inn. A woman named Zita Cobb was from this area and became extremely wealthy in some .com ventures. She decided to build this highly rated international hotel in her hometown to boost the local economy. The hotel boasts top-line entertainers and people travel to this remote spot from all over the world. The minimum 2-night stay will cost you well over $3,000. While the Fogo Island Inn was enticing, we decided to stay at the local Lions Club campground for $20 a night. That campground is located at the foot of Brimstone Head. The Flat Earth Society believes that Brimstone Head is one of the 4 corners of the earth. Locals told us that flat earthers come here on a regular basis to scratch this corner off of their bucket list. This camp was no doubt the most special of our trip. We apologize for subjecting you to so many photos of the ice and icebergs around the camp, but the beauty changed constantly with the light and left us no choice but to show the viewer a bunch of pictures. Waking up to these views from camp was quite something. Enough! The return ferry trip. There was so much ice that the captain needed to wiggle the bow back and forth several times to get up to the dock. A view from the ferry. Then on to Twillingate. Scarecrows are fairly common in the Maritimes, and these two gents were there to welcome us. A few scenes from the Twillingate area. The Twillingate Lighthouse. Had to stay at this place. Unfortunately, time ran short, and we were unable to visit the actual town of Dildo in southeastern Newfoundland and photograph the statue of Captain Dildo and the giant squid. Next time. The following pictures are from the Bonavista Peninsula and the town of Bonavista. The Bonavista Lighthouse. And this is the spot where John Cabot is said to have made landfall in the New World. When we were on the ferry from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland, a man at the information desk said that Elliston would be a good place to see Atlantic puffins. He was right. This is one of several offshore islands with puffin colonies. It was cold and very windy, so much wind that it was difficult to stabilize our cameras. But here goes. We realized that some of the photos are a bit blurry, but decided to include them anyway. Shortly after leaving Elliston, we came across this little guy by the side of the road. In Newfoundland, we saw quite a few of these large-scale wooden model boats in people's front yards. Pretty neat. We were just getting settled in our home for the night at Loxton Path Provincial Park when who should pull in but Chuck and Barb. We hadn't seen them in 4 days and ended up having a very pleasant evening in their camper van. We had planned to go south to St. John's and below, but time was getting short, so we decided to do that portion of Newfoundland on our next trip. Put in a long day of driving north and then west and ended up at Grossmorn National Park. Not surprisingly, as it had been their plan, Chuck and Barb were there when we arrived. The following day we drove up the west coast, stopping at various features and attractions such as this rock formation known as the Arches. We also pulled in at numerous small coastal fishing villages and stopped at the site of the 1919 shipwreck of the SS Ethie. You never know what you'll see in Newfoundland. The next stop was the town of Port au Choix. When we were in Newfoundland in 2003, I took a photo of this building and the same boat that's tied up on the right side. Here are two local lobstermen at work. Here is a Basque-style dory called a chalupa. This one was actually constructed by Basque boat builders in Spain and donated to the town of Port au Choix. I'll talk more about Basque whalers when we get to Labrador. The Point Riche lighthouse is located several miles from Port au Choix. In the center of this photo you can see a whale spout. This was taken from the lighthouse. Also taken from the lighthouse were these two young grazing caribou. That evening, we camped at another Lions Club campground on the beach at Port au Choix. There were only 2 other campers in the whole area. View from bed the following morning. A disgruntled businessman placed this sign for all who enter Port au Choix to see. On our way back to the highway heading north, we stopped at this marine service yard in Port Sanders. All manner of large fishing vessels were scattered about the yard in various stages of rehabilitation. We spoke briefly with these men who were busy repairing fishing nets. They were very friendly and didn't mind answering my dumb questions about the boats or about their profession. That's a lot of net to keep in good shape. Here, we're back on the highway and heading up the northern peninsula. Newfoundland is home to some unique practices. I'll briefly look at 2 of them. The first is the construction of roadside gardens. The question we posed to many locals was, why do people put their gardens along the roadbeds? Some say it's because the folks do not have the land to plant a garden, so they do it in this public space, while others explained the phenomenon by saying that the soil in Newfoundland is so rocky that people put the gardens wherever they can find decent dirt. The second unique practice concerns firewood. Everywhere you go, you see stacks or piles of cut firewood. It was explained to us that folks go out each spring to cut wood for the following winter. Then they leave the wood pretty much anywhere to season. Each person affixes his or her wood cutting permit to the pile. A man told me that essentially there was a code among the woodcutters and nobody would ever consider stealing the wood despite its unmonitored state. Additionally, you see sleds like those pictured here everywhere you go. The sleds are used to haul the wood from the cutting location to the storing location. Today the sleds are often pulled with snowmobiles. In one of the coastal towns, we came upon a small-scale lobstering operation. Using small boats like these, men go out very early in the morning and check their pots, then return in the afternoon. I had the opportunity to talk with one of the lobstermen. His name was Evan, and he said he's been doing this for 47 years. Each of these boxes holds about 50 pounds of lobster. A bit farther north, we spotted this trawler returning from a day's work. Everyone in Newfoundland and Labrador tells you don't drive at night. The moose make it too dangerous. The next 3 nights were spent at Pistolet Bay Provincial Park. The park is near to the Viking site of Les Meadows and not too far from the ferry to Labrador. We actually stayed in a different campsite, but took this photo to show how much snow was still around in the latter part of June. Oh, by the way, when we arrived, Chuck and Barb, whom we hadn't seen in a few days, were there. Found these moose droppings right behind the camper one morning. They were not there when we went to bed. Again, lots of icebergs in this area. This steel silhouette is located at Les Meadows. Archaeological evidence proves that the Norse had a small settlement here almost 500 years prior to Columbus' discovery of the New World. Scientists have constructed replicas of the structures employed by the earliest Viking inhabitants. Here we see one of the reenactors taking a break. It was a cold, windy, and wet day, so all were glad when the outside tour ended and we could enter the longhouse. There were 4 or 5 reenactors in the longhouse who answered questions and demonstrated some traditional practices. The view out to sea from the longhouse. Not too far from the cultural center, we find this statue of Leif Erikson. The next day, Ginny and I kicked around the town of Raleigh, which was not too far from our campground. It's a beautiful little fishing village, and the early morning fog and ice added a special effect to our pictures. An ecological preserve was located on the far side of the bay, and we did some exploring. The following series depicts an iceberg hunter hard at work procuring ice for drinks later that evening. More photos of the Raleigh area. The next morning, we caught the ferry to Labrador. That's Chuck and Barb's camper van in front of us. The ferry actually docks in a little sliver of far eastern Quebec. Before proceeding east to Labrador, we explored the only road heading west and followed the coastline for about 40 miles. stopped at this waterfall along the way. Here was another puffin viewing area, but it was too foggy to see anything. Along the way, we stopped at a small family business selling mussels and lobsters. One of the owners showed us around the facility. We bought lobsters from the lady, and she cooked and cracked them open for us. From there, we reversed direction and traveled back into Labrador. The road from Blanc-Sablon, where the ferry landed, northeast to Red Bay was fairly rough. The combination of frost heave and potholes made for slow going. We were heading for Pinware River Provincial Park, but when we got there it was closed due to snow. So, we just found a flat turnout and called it home for the night. We camped in this manner for the rest of our time in Labrador. After a long day on the road, that evening we enjoyed a lobster and pasta dinner with our new friends. The next morning we continued on to Red Bay, where they have two interesting cultural centers. Turns out it was Native Peoples Day, and visitors were treated to samples of traditional food and drink from the region. As mentioned earlier, there's a strong Basque influence in this area of Canada. Between 1530 and the early 1600s, Basque whalers from France and Spain set up temporary camps near Red Bay for about 6 months each year, then they would return home. As many as 600 men came each season to capture whales migrating the Strait of Belle Isle between Newfoundland and Labrador. The dory, or chalupa, on display here is almost completely original. The one shown earlier in the slideshow was a modern-day reconstruction. From the cultural centers, we took a short boat ride out to Saddle Island. We took a self-guided tour around the island, which featured vestiges of a time when this was a major whaling center, and saw some pretty attractive plant life. These are the remains of the Bernier, a coal transport ship that was driven aground in 1966. Joining us on the Saddle Island trip were two young Canadians. This is Nick Pierre, who, for some inexplicable reason, loves to swim in cold water. Nick sent me this picture taken a day earlier when he actually swam out and hopped on this small iceberg. Brrr! After leaving Red Bay, we head north and west on the Trans-Labrador Highway toward Labrador City and the Quebec border. That portion of the trip is approximately 700 miles. Some paved, but much of the road is still gravel. Shortly after starting out on the Trans-Labrador Highway, you must make a half-hour time zone adjustment to your watch. We started traveling the Trans-Labrador Highway with Chuck and Barb. Here we are greeted by a few of the locals. Jenny and I decided to take a side trip to the coastal town of St. Louis, which has one of several iceberg alleys that we came across on this trip. On the way to St. Louis, we came upon these on top of a cliff next to the road. Piled rock figures called inuksuks are common throughout the Arctic. However, this was the first time we saw a dog accompanying two humans. A few days earlier, we had received a text message from my brother Tom stating that our father had been admitted to the hospital. At this point in the trip, we decided to alter course and to visit Dad again. With this in mind, we said goodbye to Chuck and Barb and increased our miles driven per day in an effort to reach New Jersey as quickly as possible. Another curious critter. Because this area is so remote, The government sponsors a program that allows you to pick up a satellite phone at the beginning of the Trans-Labrador Highway and turn it in at the end. It's for emergency purposes only, and there is no charge. Shortly after passing through Labrador City, we came to the Quebec border. From here, we headed south another 350 miles to Baie-Comeau on the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Again, much of this road was gravel. The safety system in Quebec consisted of a series of SOS phones placed periodically along the road. More gravel pit camping. After miles of nothing but trees and beautiful scenery, we were surprised to encounter this dam and hydroelectric facility known as Manic 5. Later that day, we also ran into Manics 4 through 1. The last ferry ride for this trip took us from Baie-Comeau across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to Matane, also in Quebec. The unusual thing about this ferry is that everyone had to back aboard. We've been on a lot of ferries and never had that experience before. Here, Jenny took a picture of our backup camera as we were boarding the vessel. When we exited the ferry, we decided to press on to reach a provincial park just over the border in New Brunswick. However, when we got there, it was past midnight and the park was closed. We were kind of screwed. It was the middle of the night, raining steadily, and most of the informational signs in the area were in French. After a bit, we saw some lights on in what looked like a clinic. Turns out it was a nursing home. We explained our dilemma to one of the night workers, and he allowed us to set up in their parking lot as long as we were gone by 6 a.m. when the day shift workers began to arrive. At that point, he was our hero. When in Canada, as long as you're not dieting, Tim Hortons are everywhere and they are always crowded. Good coffee and a wide variety of donuts and pastries lure folks in at all hours of the day and night. After our night at the nursing home, we crossed back into the U.S. at Holton, Maine, and ended up spending the night at Burlingame State Park in Rhode Island. Here we are crossing the Hudson River on the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York State. For the next 3 days, we stayed at Keswick, America, a Christian retreat center located right next to the Pines where my dad lives. Here is a picture of part of the grounds of Keswick. After visiting with my dad, who was now back in the Hamilton section of the Pines for some rehabilitation, it was time to beat feet for California. For years, we've talked about stopping at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland on one of our trips, and we decided that this was the year to make that happen. So we swung quite a few miles off our planned route to do Cleveland. This Great Lakes ore carrier was docked right next to the Hall of Fame. This is the backside of the building. And this is the front. We limited our stay to 3 hours, and by doing so, probably missed some good displays. One of our last campsites near Angola, Indiana. Every time we're in or near Ohio, Jenny needs to satisfy her craving for some Skyline chili, a Cincinnati favorite. We ran into this young couple at a rest stop in eastern Kansas. They won a contest for developing the graphics on the side of this new Airstream base camp trailer. They are now traveling the country serving as ambassadors for Airstream and Nissan trucks. This is an 80-foot tall easel with a reproduction of Van Gogh's painting entitled Three Sunflowers in a Vase in the town of Goodland in western Kansas. It was a project developed by the local Rotary Club to attract people to Goodland. I guess it worked, as we would not have otherwise stopped. This was our last campsite of the trip in Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. Just outside of Las Vegas, we stopped to see the Seven Magic Mountains, a public art installation by Hugo Rondinone. These colorful piles of rocks stand in stark contrast to the desert landscape that surrounds them. Greeted by Motley, one of our two cats, we arrived home at about 5:30 on the 3rd of July. Total mileage for the trip was 12,528 miles. We were out for 51 days, or 7.5 weeks, and we spent 35 nights in the camper. Thank you for taking the time to watch our slideshow, and we hope you enjoyed it.